with the amazing Penny George. And Penny has her own personal story, like most people in this field, with using the mind-body techniques to heal herself from ME. And she's also been involved in making a film called Living Proof, 2 films. And yeah, so she's going to tell us more. I'm also going to hand over to her to introduce herself more fully. And yeah, so you go for it, Penny. Thank you so much.
Sure, thank you, Aoife. Yeah, I'm Penny, as Aoife said, and I had ME for just over 2 years, 2017 to 2019, and I wasn't what they would class as severe with ME, although there were phases where it was severe. There were phases where I was bedbound, but not all the time. But it was pretty miserable. And in 2019, I was unbelievably, it still seems incredible to me, I was introduced to the work of Dr. John Sarno, who's written a lot on the mind-body approach that you now use, and I'm also promoting in my work. I was introduced to his work and his theories, and this is the short version of the story, but I recovered very quickly from my illness, and was completely blown away by this. You know, as everyone is when they recover from things like that so quickly, or at all when you're told it's an incurable illness. And I thought, well, other people need to know about this. So I started kind of making inquiries and reaching out, and ended up working with a guy called Dan Hinesley for a couple of years. And it was with Dan that I made these 2 films that you just mentioned. So we were kind of co-producers, co-directors, co-everything on the 2 films. And then just this year, I launched a little non-profit kind of exercise called Living Proof, specifically to try and promote these approaches and help educate people about it. So I'm not working as an individual coach like you, and I don't want to, although I did train as a coach actually when I first recovered. I'm more trying to work to influence decision makers, particularly in the health sector, about how they can change their approach to treating chronic conditions and chronic pain, because there are millions of people suffering that don't need to be suffering, or could be suffering a great deal less at least. And I'd like to try and get it out there. So yeah, so that's a kind of starting point, I think.
That's so amazing. I'm so glad you're doing this work. And yeah, like for instance, my doctor, she was so open to it, and she really was so happy when I showed her Dr. Schubner's book. And like it's not like people are closed off. It's just like the information hasn't been there. So let's actually, I'd love to hear more about what exactly ME is. That would, like, I'm not even entirely sure. I think people feel like that I was fibromyalgia, IBS, and people probably think like that about fibromyalgia. They're like, what is this? So
yeah, sure. I don't have a sort of official definition up my sleeve because I think about things, but it's basically it's also often known as chronic fatigue syndrome, which tells you more about what it actually is. So really severe fatigue is often the main symptom, or a main symptom, but it's not the only symptom, and that's why the name chronic fatigue syndrome can be misleading, because there's a lot of other symptoms as well. I didn't have all the symptoms that some people have, but I had a lot of them. And I suppose one of the most challenging things for me was alongside a kind of constant level, or fairly constant level of severe fatigue, I also had these incredible energy crashes, which would come out of nowhere. I'd get about 5 minutes warning, I'd feel it coming over me. And they were so severe that I would like collapse to the floor. And they lasted, in the first year that I was ill, those crashes, they were happening every day. And they were so severe that I couldn't even open my eyes. You know, I literally was just crumpled on the floor and couldn't even open my eyes. It was bizarre. It was like somebody had just pulled the plug, you know, and I just went crumple. And of course, that meant that I was scared to leave the house because I didn't know when they were going to come. You know, if I was at work, I'm going to look absolutely ridiculous if I collapse on the floor at work, or in a supermarket, or in the street, or, you know, anywhere. So it was, there were times when I was scared to leave the house because I was scared of these crashes happening. So that was during the first year. Those crashes reduced a bit in the second year. They weren't quite as severe or quite as frequent. But alongside that, I had terrible, they call it brain fog, and it's just a kind of inability to, it just feels, like the name says, it just feels like your head is full of fog and you cannot think clearly. Sometimes you can't deal with a conversation. You just can't deal with people talking to you, or you talking to other people. You just have to shut it all out. You know, there are people with ME much more severe than I was who can't even cope with light, or, you know, they're completely bedbound and they have to stay in darkness, and everything becomes, you become massively oversensitive to any sensory input. And I had that to an extent, not as bad as some people, but pretty bad on some days. And then I did have some pain, not all the time, luckily. Some people with chronic fatigue syndrome have very severe pain as well, which is when it can sort of slip into being fibromyalgia, I think. I had pain on and off. There was one period in the second year of being ill where I forced myself to go to a family barbecue thing, and I ended up organizing a lot of it. And one of the key symptoms with ME is that you can have, they call it post-exertional malaise, which means that you might have the energy to do something, but you crash afterwards for a number of days or even a number of weeks. And I went to this family barbecue, ended up organizing a lot of it because other people didn't pull their weight, and I crashed really severely after it. And I was in agony for about 5 days, all over my body, excruciating joint and muscle pain for about 5 days, couldn't get out of bed. So that was possibly the worst period of it for me. So yeah, lots of different symptoms, but the fatigue and the crashes were probably the most constant or regular thing.
That sounds like hell. It sounds like like a lot of it does sound familiar, which is from fibromyalgia, not the exact same, but yeah, and it's certainly, I relate to the not one, like just shutting down from life, because, you know, there's so many times where I booked flights or had told, like, made promises to people to do something or show up, and then constantly just letting people down or not being able to show up, saying, you know, and eventually just stopped showing up. I stopped saying yes to my friends' weddings, like hen parties, like I was at work, like everything. I was just like, what's the point? Like, this is so painful. Not only am I totally miserable, but I'm like letting everyone down and not able to like fulfill my like duties or even do anything I enjoy. So yeah, those kinds of things I can really relate to.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I did a lot of that as well. I mean, I was lucky I wasn't ill for nearly as long as you, or nearly as long as some other people before I found this work. I know that I was lucky in that regard.
Yeah.
But yeah, I experienced it for a couple of years and it was bad enough. So
And what was the point, like, that what was the point where you heard this mind body information, you found Dr. Sarno, and like, what was your aha moment? Because actually, like, there's so much of this information out there now, and I come across so many clients who are just like overwhelmed. They're like, I have like the 7 books, 10 books, 15 books, 20 books. Some people I come across have known about the mind body teaching since 2011 earlier, and they have all the information, but like they're not really getting actually their breakthrough. And then of other people who just like, oh, I read Dr. Sarno's first book and boom, everything made sense. So what was your like aha moment?
Well, I kind of fall into the latter category, which I'm, when people ask me about this, I'm very aware that sometimes it's a bit frustrating for people to hear that some people just read the book and get better. And I do know that. But I'll say more about, the work I've done since then, I suppose, to keep myself ill. So yeah, it was very strange for me. So in the sort of last 6 months, I suppose, of being ill, I had received the formal diagnosis from my doctor. She was very kind, like you said, your doctor was, but she didn't have a solution for me. And when she gave me the official diagnosis, because it, as you'll know, it takes a long time to diagnose ME because they have to discount everything else first. So I'd been sent to every consultant in Scotland, I think, before they finally decided that it was ME or chronic fatigue syndrome. And in that consultation, when she confirmed the diagnosis, I remember her saying the words, this is chronic fatigue syndrome and there's nothing more we can do for you. This is an incurable condition. You just have to learn to live with it. And luckily, I'm a very stubborn person. And I remember thinking, no, just no, that's just not true. My brain works in a logical way, and my logic, while I was sitting in her office, in her, what do you call it, consulting room, I remember thinking, that doesn't make sense. Some kind of mechanism has caused me to develop these symptoms, and all we need to do is understand that mechanism and reverse it, and I can be better. And I remember thinking, if you're not going to do anything about it, then I'll do it myself. So that was a kind of turning point, not an aha point of getting better, not at all, but a turning point for me, because until then, I had put all my time and energy into being determined to find a structural cause for my symptoms. So giving me the formal diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome allowed me to drop that and go, okay, this is chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, how do I fix it? So I shifted direction at that point, and I shifted into how do we get better, And I started the frantic Googling that many of us do. Google for kind of 6 months. And I started opening up to the idea that that I might be able to heal myself through my own thinking. So it wasn't quite the mind-body stuff. It still wasn't, I still didn't have any understanding that actually my own brain might have been causing my symptoms. I still thought I had a physical illness, but I could fix it with my head, is what I thought. So I started buying these kind of slightly hippie books on kind of, healing visualizations and all this stuff. And I started doing those really, like, every day, committing to these healing visualizations. Absolutely nothing changed. But I didn't give up, and I kept trying. And then a few months later, I was, so my illness was quite up and down. And when I was in the ups, I was able to do something. And at one point, I was visiting a Buddhist monastery that I used to go to a lot before COVID. And I was speaking to a Buddhist nun there that I knew. I had known her for a number of years. We were chatting in the toilets, as you do. It's where you get all your answers, apparently. And she said to me, she said, "How are you?" And I said, "I'm still not good, I'm still not well. I've been off work for a long time." And she said, "Oh," she said, "you should really look up the work of this Dr. John Sarno. He's an American doctor." She said, she sort of gave me a 2-sentence explanation of his theory, that something about repressed emotions might be causing your symptoms. Da, da, da. And I remember thinking, doesn't sound likely because I have a structural illness. But luckily I logged the name in my brain, and I got home a couple of days later, and I don't know how many days later it came back to me, and I thought, I'll just have a look at this guy, Dr. Sarno, and see what he's all about. So I started looking him up on YouTube, and I watched a couple of interviews just like this. Actually, they weren't interviews so much, they were people giving speeches at conferences that happened to be filmed. People American people who had recovered through being treated by Dr. Sarno, not from ME, from other conditions. I didn't find anything about ME. They were about pain mainly. But it intrigued me, and I kind of thought, well, okay, maybe I should explore this a little bit more. So I decided to order one of his books, and I ordered his last book, which was called The Divided Mind, because his previous books were more specifically about back pain. Back pain wasn't my issue, but his last book was the same theory, but broadening it out to other conditions. And I thought, well, that's going to be more relevant to me. So I ordered the book, and it arrived on the 23rd of August 2019. I'll never forget the date as long as I live. And that evening, that night, when I went to bed, I read, I can't remember how much, but I would guess maybe half of the book before I went to sleep. Maybe not half, maybe even a third, I don't know. But I read it, and in that first section that I did read of the book, there's a section where he says something like around 20% of people will recover just from reading this book. And I remember thinking, it would be ridiculous. How could that possibly happen? You know, it's just ridiculous. And anyway, I finished reading, I closed the book, I went to sleep. And I woke up in the morning, and something was different in the morning already. And I thought, oh, I'm having a good day, because I did have good days. And I thought, oh, I'm having a good day, that's great. And I had arranged to go and see a friend. And like you know, 9 times out of 10, I probably would have had to cancel going to see that friend. But this day, it was a good day. So I thought, right, I can go. So I was getting ready to go and see this friend. And while I was getting ready, the post arrived. And this letter came through the door. And I opened it, and it was from my employers at the time. And by that point, I had been off work for a total of about 8 months, not all at once, but in total, you know, added up to about 8 months over the 2 years that I'd been ill. And this letter was advising me that I'd reached basically the limit of my sick pay, and they were putting me onto no pay. I wasn't at work at the time. And something happened inside me when I read that letter. And you know, the first reaction was utter panic, because I thought, I've lost my job. I was still employed, but with no pay. I thought, I'm going to lose my house, I'm going to lose my car, I can't pay for anything. You know, I live on my own, so there's nobody else to pick up the costs of things. And so it was utter panic. And then through the middle of that panic, suddenly this feeling just came, and I still don't have any scientific explanation for this. But this feeling came from sort of inside my tummy, and it shot up the middle of me, right up through my head, just this sudden explosion. And it was like, I'm free, I'm free. I hated that place of work. Latterly, it had become very toxic, which I now know was part of what was actually making me ill, but I didn't know that at the time. And suddenly there's just this absolute sense of freedom just came with that letter. And it was like nothing I'd ever experienced before in my life, just this massive release of something absolutely huge. And I was shaking like crazy with sort of fear and confusion and joy and all these emotions just going, oh my God, you know, this is just something weird is happening. But of course I had to go and see this friend because it was time to leave. So I got in the car, I took the letter with me, and I got in the car. And I drove to my friend's house. I got to her door, and I was like, ah! You know, completely like, you know, I don't know what I must have sounded like to her. And she knew how ill I'd been, and she's quite an alternative kind of person. So I sat there and I talked at her for hours about this book and about the theory and about the feeling that I'd had when I read the letter, all the stuff that had happened. And she just sat and listened to me. And I still think of her as the friend that kind of witnessed my recovery. She watched me get well in front of her. And, you know, when I'd been ill, I would have expected to be able to stay with a friend for, you know, maybe an hour or 2 hours at the very most, and then go home, collapse into bed and be ill for a few days, you know, to get over it. And I sat in her kitchen for 6 hours talking at her. So just completely, you know, uncontrollable, like this feeling, this incredible feeling. So my aha moment wasn't it wasn't a conscious aha moment. Something just changed in my whole system. Something just clicked on or off or whatever happened. It just all went just like that. So it was a pretty incredible experience.
Oh my God, I have full goosebumps listening to you. That is so, so powerful. I also actually really relate to that defiance, like that you shared. And often I actually, now that you've put it in the context of maybe an aha moment, but I often think that was, I really had that. I was really like not settling. I was really not backing down. Like no matter what kind of consultant or professional or, you know, how well-meaning the person was, I was really not backing down. I was like you, I was like, that doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to me that something would just be incurable. And I think because I had been told also throughout my life, like pretty much everything I ever got, like I used to have acne, like boils all over my face. And the mind body teaching also, I think before I knew about it, I think I used that on my acne. But I was told over and over again that there was no solution. It was like antibiotics and it was a pill and it was this, but really it just kept going on and on. It was hormones, it was teenager, it was this. And actually throughout my life, unless it was an infection, a broken arm, like unless it was something that could just be treated immediately, any ongoing issue I had throughout my whole entire life, eventually, like when I took the medicine, took the thing, did the thing, jumped through the hoop, twirled around 3 times, touched the ground, then eventually say, that's it, we're out of suggestions. Like, yeah. And so that, I remember being a teenager and like saying to my dad, bless him, like my dad's an amazing doctor and a beautiful man. I remember just like crying and crying, just like, what do you mean? Like you can't like give me these solutions. Like, so anyway, I really, really relate to what you shared about that kind of defiance and that kind of just like, no, that doesn't make sense to me. I'm gonna, if you're not doing it. And in that, right, I actually think that there is this assertiveness and this taking your power back, this kind of strength. So you're no longer just like kind of hopelessly, powerlessly, like going ping ponging around different healers and doctors and teachers and this, like, save me, save me, save me, save me. Eventually you just go, I'm going to do this. And because I know in Schubner's book, he really teaches a lot of like using assertiveness to like stand up to the symptoms and like even like standing up straight. And so that flipping the switch from like feeling so powerless, which is keeping you in a fear response anyway. So yeah, I'm loving that you shared that. That really resonated.
Yeah. No, I think the taking your power back or recognizing that you have that power is one of the most important elements of this. And when people start to understand that, the world is going to change. You know, when this gets understood better, I think it's going to be transformational, because that we're so conditioned in our society to rely on the doctor, you know, to fix us. And it's so depressing, you know, and it's difficult. Like even now, I remember seeing a friend recently who she's a really good friend and I love her dearly. And she sort of, you might have friends like this who sort of almost get the mind body stuff, but they don't fully get it. And I was at her house and I was telling her that I wasn't feeling great that day. You know, as you know, life is just an up and down thing and it's a constant management of our own symptoms. And it wasn't chronic fatigue symptoms, it was just life. You know, I just wasn't having a great day. So I said something in passing to this friend about, oh, I can't remember what I had, a sore throat or a headache or whatever it was. And she said, oh, I'll give you the phone number of my friend who's a naturopath. And I said, I don't need the phone number of your friend who's a naturopath. You know, I know this is mind body stuff and I can manage it myself. I was just telling you why I'm not as lively as I might normally be or whatever. And she got really upset with me because I didn't want the phone number of her friend. She got really upset with me, and it got quite awkward and difficult because she felt I was refusing her offer of help. And I was trying to say to her, I don't need your offer of help. I was just reporting how I was feeling. I wasn't looking for help. So it's difficult for people to understand. It is hard for people to understand, but it's so important. And I think one of the things where I think and this is my own personal opinion, it's not what I'm putting out as part of living proof at the moment because we don't have the scientific evidence for this. But one of the things where I think I differ a little bit from other people on this stuff is that other people talk about healing. I don't think of it as healing. I think of it as stopping making ourselves ill, which you could argue is the same thing. But I always think of this kind of analogy that I heard a few years ago of a little girl who's watering the garden. I might have said this to you when we chatted before, I can't remember. So there's a little girl who's watering the garden, and it's a lovely sunny day, and she's enjoying watering the flowers with the hose. And then suddenly the hose stops working, and she can't understand what's happening. And she shouts on her dad, "Daddy, Daddy, the hose has stopped working." And he comes out and he looks around, and then he says, "You're standing on the hose. You're standing on the hose." And I always think that's a really good analogy for, it's like they're in some way, and we're not doing it consciously when we're ill. Of course we're not choosing to do it, but in some way our brain has accidentally stood on its own hose and it stopped the flow.
I love this so much. I had a coach last year, and she actually used to use this. She'd say, it's like you're on a treasure hunt. It was a different kind of coach, wasn't exactly mind body, but it was similar stuff. She said, it's like you're on a treasure hunt, and when you find a kink in the hose, that's a great thing. And I, for sure, totally, this resonates with me because I was in the kind of like healing community. I've always been I was brought up with alternative and conventional medicine, and my dad's a doctor, my granddad's a doctor. I've always been obsessed with this, and I was a holistic therapist. So anyway, yeah, I've always been in this like healing world. And then what you're always perpetuating is that you're broken and that you need to be fixed. And then you get more into this like releasing the trauma. So I got into this then, like, oh, okay, when I found the mind body teaching, I was like, oh, okay, I'm traumatized. I need to find the traumas and like weed them out and then rewrite them and they'll be gone. And I did a lot of this style of journaling, and I did plant medicines, and I did EFT, and all the while and like RTT and all these different things and for me, as like part of my path, it was just like stressing me out, going back into the past. And like for a few years, I was constantly doing these things between journaling and EFT and the different types, go back into the past. And all I found was that they were endless, big T's, little T's. My dad shouting at me, like, do you know what I mean? They were endless, bullying in school, whatever, all these different things. And I was like, I am not getting any better. I'm burnt out. I'm totally wrecked, exhausted. And it was like, oh, another release, and you're releasing more and releasing more. And like my nervous system was just getting more and more shot, like going back into the past. And I was just so exhausted and tired. And for me, that was another breakthrough, because I was just like, no more, no more healing this like problem, no more digging around. And like, I remember one day sitting in a cafe with a friend, and I was just like, no more like picking at scabs. It was like, oh, why is that happening? Oh, maybe it's because of this wound. Oh, let's pick at it and make it bleed. And then, oh, it's a big release. You're healing. And it was just like, what the hell? Like, I wasn't getting anywhere continuing with that. So that was a moment for me where I was just like, I'm dropping this, and I'm looking at trying to find another way.
Well, I think, I think it's really, really important that you're saying that, because, the what we all talk about as the mind-body approach is not just one thing. is it's a number of different tools and techniques, and different things work for different people. And I know people where journaling has been the answer for them, and digging through the traumas of the past has helped them and has resolved their pain or their illness. And other people who, just like you, have found that it in itself creates more trauma, and it's not a helpful way to go, and something else, other tools or techniques have worked better for them. So I think that's a really important point, actually, is that, people need to, and this is a hard thing to do when you're ill, but need to start to learn to get in touch with what's working for them and what's actually just making things worse. And if something's really not working for you and it's just making you miserable, then drop it and move on to something else. One of the other tools and techniques. I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, I agree with you, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, finding what works for you, and yeah. And there are so many different ways of like receiving this information, and this information like resonating with you. So I read a post that someone wrote on Instagram, I think it was yesterday, and they were like, I hate the way there's so many different people, like, it's like teaching this in different ways, and they can be conflicting information. And wow, like I just really thought that like it lands differently, like for different people. And for sure, I'm highly sensitive, and the people who end up being attracted to me are also highly sensitive. And so whatever about my path and how it worked out for me resonates with them. And so yeah, that's why it is a really powerful thing that there's lots of different people talking about it in different ways from their own direct experience. And that's what I loved about when I found Dr. Schubiner and any of the mind body doctors, is that they spoke about it from their own experience, like, and their own childhoods and their own pain. So it makes it very, it kind of bridged the gap between like doctor and patient, or therapist and patient, whereas it was very humbling. It was very easy. It's easier for me to receive information from someone when they're speaking from their direct experience, when they're sharing from the heart, or, it's more tangible for me. So, yeah.
Definitely. I think I've been with Living Proof, I've been doing a few workshops with a local, in Edinburgh, pain group that is set up by a GP who's one of my medical advisors on Living Proof, and a health education charity that she works with. They're running this kind of 6-week pain course. They've run a few series of it, and they have invited me along to run a couple of workshops talking about the mind-body approach to pain, and about journaling, and about different tools and techniques and things. And at the end of, I always start the workshops by telling my own story and talking about what it was that I now know led to me being ill. What the experiences were in my life that made me ill. Whenever I tell people, it really hits home. You can see in the group, the participants, they really, something really hits them. They're like, oh wow, okay. And at the end of the last workshop that I did, the lady from the health education charity who organizes the group, she came up to me and said, oh, she said, I'm so envious of you. I wish I'd had a pain or illness, because your story is so inspiring. It's really funny. And it's a funny thing, isn't it? Like, a lot of people who come through this end up, I don't know if it would be the case for somebody like you when it's affected so much of your life. I don't know if you would end up saying you were ever grateful for it, but many people do, don't they? It's hell on earth, but you come through it and you're a different person on the other side. And I always feel like I'm on the other side of this huge secret, which shouldn't be a secret. It should be known by everyone in the world. Well, and some traditional societies do know it, I think, and live by it. But in our westernized society, we're so conditioned to believe in the Western medical model of something being wrong with the body, meaning that there is something wrong with the body, which actually isn't the case, you know. So yeah, I think it's an incredible thing to have gone through, and I just hope that I can help other people, you know, find their way through it as well.
Yeah, for sure. I do feel weirdly grateful for my illness. I feel like it was my soul just screaming at me to change. It was just like, this isn't good enough. This isn't good enough. Like there has to be something else. I don't know what it was doing, but it was just screaming at me until until I found it was like so unbearable. You know, it was so unbearable. I couldn't have just rolled over and been okay, I'll just keep going along the way I've had my whole life and the only way I live. It was so unbearable. Like, thank you, illness, for being so unbearable that I had to do anything and everything. I had to stretch far beyond and do things to change. I had to change, and that was the only way. But I would love to talk about stress, right? Because I feel like stress has been around, like the word, the dialogue that stress causes, like, you know, so much illness. But then if you had have told me, and I think I did have a doctor or so say, like, are you stressed? I would have just freaked out at them, because, you know, I was like a Dzogchen Tibetan practitioner for years. I had, you know, done more therapy than most people I knew. And then I also hear this from a lot of other people, like clients and other people. They're like, but I'm not stressed. Like, and so it really is like this subconscious stress. In my experience, I didn't even realize how stressed out I was about every single thing in my life. My relationships, just sitting with myself, my own mind was just so stressful. It was constantly generating all my habits and beliefs, the way I related to myself, anyone around me, the whole world, everything, the way I thought about time, you know, my days, everything I was so stressed about, and it was generating all this illness in my body.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And Dr. Sarno defines, he talks about stress a lot in his book. I can only say book because I've only had to read one because I got better so quickly. But I imagine he talks about it in the other books too. And he sort of tries to emphasize that the current modern understanding of the word stress isn't what he means by stress. So I think he sort of refers to 3 types of stress. So one can be the current modern understanding of stress, you know, like you've got far too much work on, you've got, you know, you're busy with your kids, you haven't got enough money, daily stresses of life. So that can be one of the things that, of course, can lead to symptoms. But then the way that he defines stress is it can also be stress. I suppose you might, another word you might use is trauma, but not with a capital T necessarily. So just like you said earlier, you know, the small baby traumas that many of us had in our childhoods or in just in life, like being bullied by somebody at school or being bullied by somebody at work, which was one of the things that was happening to me when I was ill. You know, or trauma, terrible trauma like physical abuse, sexual abuse, all of those things, of course, count as well. And he, the way that Dr. Sarno explains stress is he's saying that those things that have happened in our past can now be causing stress in our brains now, because our brains are misinterpreting what's happening to us now as being a threat to our lives, and our brains have switched on the fight or flight mechanism because our brain learned from something that happened to us in our past that this is the response we need to have, when actually right now you're not in a life-threatening situation. And then the third thing is kind of what you're talking about, is the personal characteristics. And many people who end up with these types of chronic conditions or chronic pain have similar personality characteristics. And they all add up to us being very, very hard on ourselves. You know, so we're often perfectionists, we're often people pleasers, kind of do-gooders, often real high achievers with very high expectations of ourselves and of other people. And I fit into pretty much all of those. Yeah, you too. I think we're quite similar, aren't we? So, so yeah, I think stress, you have to, when you hear people talking about stress causing illnesses, I think you have to broaden the definition of stress to get the full understanding of what it means. Yeah.
I absolutely love that. That was, yeah, that's just, it's just music to my ears. Like you said, like, I'm like, everyone needs to know.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I could talk to you forever, and I absolutely adore chatting with you. And I'd love you to let people know about your films and Living Proof a little bit. So I'll get you to send me the details, and I'll post them in the comments and everything, so people can go directly to check them out.
Great.
But you want to tell people about them, about Living Proof and the 2 films?
Yeah, I'd love to. So Living Proof, the website, first of all, is livingproof.org.uk. And like I said at the beginning, it's just a little sort of, well, little at the moment, maybe bigger in the future, kind of non-profit social enterprise that I launched in September this year, specifically to educate people about this. And like I said, we're kind of targeting decision makers, policymakers, you know, rather than individual patients, although a lot of the information on the website is also relevant to individuals who are suffering with symptoms and want to look into this more. So livingproof.org.uk, and then the films are there on the website. So there's 2 films that we made along with my colleague Dan. The first film so both of the films are 12 minutes long, so they're only short, and we did that deliberately because we're aware that, you know, if you're ill with pain or other conditions, you might not have a long attention span. You might just want to watch something short as a brief introduction to the concept. So they're both 12 minutes long. The first one tells the story of a young lady called Charlie, who lives in London. She recovered from chronic pain. She had pain all over her body, and she tells her story in the film of how she recovered. And the second one tells the story of a young lady called Fiona, who had ME like me, but for a much, much longer time. She was ill for about 14 years with ME. And she talks like you about really hitting rock bottom and being like, no, I cannot live like this. I have to find a way out. And that was what led her to try the mind-body approach in the end. So yeah, both the films are there on our website.
That's amazing. I saw that film. Yeah, it's so powerful. And I was just thinking there that possibly if someone was suffering with symptoms, could they could they send their own doctor there and or show them to their own doctor? Maybe if they were uncertain but thinking, does this apply to them? Maybe they could do it together with their doctor or collaborate or something. That might be helpful.
Absolutely. So a lot of the kind of introductory information on the website would be useful for patients or practitioners. There's also a kind of self-assessment quiz on our website, which is adapted from it's a shortened version of a quiz, which is hosted on our kind of American sister organization's website, the PPPA in America. With their permission. So there's a self-assessment quiz that you can work through the questions, and you know, the more questions you answer yes to, the more likely it is that your condition is a mind-body, is of a mind-body nature. So there's that might be interesting for a person to look at with their doctor. But we also have a dedicated section for health practitioners. There's a tab at the top of the website for practitioners, and there's a PDF that health practitioners, doctors can download for more information about how to support a patient with a mind-body condition. So yeah, absolutely.
Oh my God. So amazing that that is out there in the world now and that it's spreading and people are just going to have so many more options now. And yeah, like you said, so beautifully, like learn that you always did have more power than you thought, in your own journey to, feeling better and stronger and wiser, more peace, more strength. And so, yeah, thank you so much for getting that out into the world. And thank you so much for being here today and chatting with me. I feel like I learned a lot. And I'm like always blown away by the wisdom that pours forth from these teachings, and anyone who like fully participates in their own